Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 21. Esteban Trueba told him he was welcome to stay in Tres Marias for as long as he thought necessary. Blanca said nothing, but from that day on she refused to join them at the table and missed no opportunity to make the Frenchman feel unwanted. She put away her party dresses and the silver candlesticks and carefully avoided him. She told her father that if he ever mentioned marriage again, she would take the first train out of town and return to her convent as a novice. "You'll change your mind," Esteban roared. "I doubt it," she replied. The arrival of the twins at Tres Marias that year was a great relief. They brought a gust of freshness and vitality to the oppressed atmosphere of the hacienda. Neither of the brothers appreciated the Frenchman's charms, despite the discreet attempts to win their favor. Jamie and Nicholas made fun of his fine manners, his effeminate shoes, and his foreign name, but Jean de Satingue did not seem to mind. His good humor disarmed them in the end, and they wound up spending the remainder of the summer on good terms. They even joined forces with them to lure Blanca out of her determined obstinacy. "You're already 24, sister. Do you want to end up saying rosaries to the poor?" They tried to convince her to cut her hair and copy the dresses that were all the rage in the fashion magazines, but she had no interest in these exotic styles, which would not have had a prayer of surviving the Dust Bowl of the countryside. The twins were so different they did not even look like brothers. Jamie was tall, robust, timid, and studious. Since his school required it, he had managed to develop an athletic build in gym, but he viewed sports as a dull and useless pastime. How could not He could not understand how John de Sadingue could spend the whole morning hitting a ball with a stick just to knock it through a metal hoop, when it was so much easier to put it in with your hand. Jamie had various strange habits that became evident around that time and grew more pronounced over the course of his life. He did not like anyone to breathe too close to him, shake his hand, ask him personal questions, ask to borrow books, or write him letters. This made his dealings with people difficult, but it did not isolate him, because within 5 minutes of meeting him, it was clear that despite his peevish attitude, he was generous and candid and had a tremendous capacity for kindness, which he tried in vain to cover up because it embarrassed him. He was much more interested in others that he led on, and it was easy to move him. The tenants of Tres Marias called him the little patron, and he was one they turned to whenever they needed something. Jamie would listen to them without saying a word, responding in monosyllables, and then turn his back on them, but he would not rest until he had solved their problem. He was unsociable, and his mother said that even as a child he would not let anybody touch him. From the time he was a little boy, he had outlandish habits. He would take his clothes off and give him to someone else. Affection and the expression of emotion struck him as signs of inferiority. Only with animals did he relax his exaggerated modesty. He rolled on the ground with them, ran his hands over them, fed them directly in the mouth, and slept curled up with the dogs. He would do the same with very young children, provided no one was watching. When there were other people around, he preferred to play the strong, solitary man. His 12 years of British schooling had failed to give him spleen, which was considered a gentleman's most attractive trait. He was incorrigibly sentimental. Was why he had become interested in politics and decided not to be a lawyer, as his father wished, but a doctor who would help the needy, and as his father, who knew him better, had suggested. Jamie had played with Pedro Terrace Garcia throughout his childhood, but not until that year did he come to admire him. Blanca had to forego 2 of their meetings by the river in order for the young men to meet. They talked of justice, equality, of the peasant movement, of socialism, while Blanca listened with impatience, wishing they would hurry up and finish their discussion so she could be alone with her lover. The friendship linked the 2 boys until death, without Esteban Trueba ever finding out. Nicholas was as pretty as a girl. He had inherited his mother's delicate, transparent skin, and was small, astute, and fleet-footed as a fox. He was blindingly intelligent, and effortlessly surpassed his brother in everything they undertook together. He had invented a game to torture him with. He would take the opposing side on any argument and would argue so well and so pervasively that he had always ended convincingly Jamie that he was wrong, forcing him to admit his error. "Are you sure I'm right?" Nicholas would finally ask his brother. "Yes, you're right," Jamie would grudgingly admit, with a rectitude that prevented him from arguing in bad faith. "Good," Nicholas would exclaim, "because now I'm going to prove that you're right and I'm wrong. I'm going to give you the arguments you would have given me if you were smarter." Jamie would lose patience and start beating up his brother, but he would quickly regret it because he was much stronger than Nicholas, and his own strength made him feel guilty. At school, Nicholas used his intelligence to pester others, and whenever he found himself faced with a violent situation, he would call his brother to defend him while he egged him on from behind. Jamie got used to standing in for Nicholas, and it seemed perfectly normal to him to be punished instead of his brother, to do his homework and cover up his lies. Apart from girls, Nicholas's primary interest in that period of his life was to cultivate Clara's capacity for predicting the future. He bought books about secret societies, horoscopes, and anything that had to do with the supernatural. That year, he also took to exposing miracles. He bought a popular edition of the Lives of the Saint and spent the summer looking for ordinary explanations of the most extraordinary spiritual feats. His mother made fun of him. "If you can't understand how the telephone works," she would say, "how do you expect to understand miracles?" Nicholas's interest in supernatural things had begun a few years earlier. On the weekends, when he was allowed to leave his boarding school, he would visit the three Morris sisters in their old mill to study various occult sciences. It soon became abundantly clear that he had not the slightest talent for clairvoyant or telekinesis, and he was forced to be content with the mechanics of astrological charts, tarot cards, and the I Ching. And since one thing always led to another, at the house of the Morris sisters he met a beautiful young woman named Amanda, somewhat older than himself, who initiated him into the yoga, meditation, and acupuncture, sciences that Nicholas later used to treat rheumatism and other minor pains, which was more than his brother would be able to do with traditional medicine after 7 years of school. But that was all much later. That summer he was 21 and he was bored in the country. His brothers kept close watch to prevent him from giving the girls a hard time. But Jamie had proclaimed himself the protector of the maidenly virtues of Tres Marias. Despite this, Nicholas managed to seduce almost all the adolescent girls around, using acts of gallantry never seen in those parts. The rest of his time, Nicholas spent investigating miracles, trying to learn the tricks his mother used to move salt cellars of their mind, and writing passionate stanzas to Amanda, who sent them back by return mail, corrected and improved, without deterring her admirer in the least. Old Pedro Segunda died a few days before the presidential elections. The nation was convulsed by the campaign. Special trains crossed the country from north to south, the candidates appearing at the rear and with their reptitude of proselytes, greeting everyone exactly the same way, promising exactly the same things, festooned with banners and roaring with choral society and loudspeakers that shattered the tranquil landscape and stunned the cattle. The old man had lived so long that he was nothing more than a pile of glass bones covered by a yellow skin. His face was a lattice work of wrinkles. He clacked as he walked, rattling like a pair of castanets, and since he had no teeth, he was forced to eat baby food. Though he was blind and deaf, he never failed to recognize things, and the memory of the past and the immediate presence was remarkable. He died sitting in his wicker chair at dusk. He liked to sit in the doorway of his little house and feel the sun go down, which he could sense from the subtle change in temperature, the sounds in the courtyard, the haste of cooks, and the silence of the hens. It was there that death found him. At his feet was his great-grandson Esteban Garcia, who was by the time almost 10, driving a nail through the eyes of a chicken. He was the son of Esteban Garcia, the only bastard offspring of the patron named for him. No one knew his origin and the reason he had that name except himself, because his grandmother, Concha Garcia, had managed before she died to poison his childhood with the story that if only his father had been born in place of Blanca, Jamie, or Nicholas, he would have inherited Tres Marias. He could even have been the president of the republic if he wanted. In that part of the country which was littered with illegitimate children, and even legitimate ones who had never met their fathers, he was probably the only one to grow up hating his last name. He hated Esteban Trueba, his seduced grandmother, his bastard father, and his own explorable present fate. Esteban Trueba did not treat him any differently from any of the other children around the property. He was simply one more of the pile of creatures who sang the national anthem in the schoolhouse and stood in line to receive their Christmas presents. Trueba had forgotten all about Pancha Garcia and the fact that he had had a child with her, much less the sullen little grandson who despised him but watched him from afar to imitate his gestures and his speech. The child would lie awake at night imagining all sorts of dreadful illnesses and accidents that would put an end to the life of the patron and his children so that he could inherit the property. Tres Marias would welcome his kingdom. He nursed these fantasies throughout his life, even long after it was evident that he would receive nothing by way of inheritance. He always reproached Trueba for the dark existence he had forged for him, and he felt constantly punished, even in the days when he had reached the height of his power and had them all in his fist. The child noticed that something in the old man had changed. He went up to him and touched him, and the whole body swayed. Pedro Garcia fell to the ground like a bag of bones. His eyes were covered by the milky film that had slowly screened out all the light in the course of a quarter century. Esteban Garcia picked up his nail and was just about to stick it in his father's eye when Blanca arrived and showed him away. Never suspecting that this evil, dark-skinned creature was his nephew and that he would one day be the instrument of a tragedy that would befall our family. "Oh God, he's dead!" she sobbed, leaning over the body of the old man who had told the child of his stories and protected her clandestine love affair. Old Pedro Garcia was buried following a 3-day wake, for which, on instructions from Esteban Trueba, no expense was spared. They placed the body in a coffin of rough pine and laid him out in a Sunday suit, the same one he wore at his wedding and whenever he went to vote or lined up for his 50 paces at Christmas. They dressed him in his one white shirt, which was very loose around the neck because he had shrunk with age, and his morning tie with a red carnation in his lap as on all festive occasions. They held his jaw in place with a handkerchief and placed his black hat on his head because he had repeatedly declared that he wanted to take it off when he said hello to God. He had no shoes, so Clara went and took a pair that belonged to Esteban Trueba for everyone to see that he would not go barefoot to heaven. Jean Sunday was excited about the funeral. He showed up with a camera and tripod he had extracted from his belongings, and took so many portraits of the dead man that his relatives were afraid he might steal his soul, so he destroyed the plates. The wake was attended by peasants from throughout the region because over the course of a century-long lifetime, Pedro Garcia had become related to many of the local farmers. The curandera arrived along with several Indians from her tribe, who began to weep for the deceased when she gave the order, but did not stop until the reveling was over 3 days later. People gathered outside the old man's house to drink wine, play the guitar, and keep an eye on the steers that were being roasted. The priests on bicycles also arrived to bless the mortal remains of Pedro Garcia and oversee the funeral rites. One of them was a rubicund giant with a strong Spanish accent, Father Jose Dulce Maria, whose name was familiar to Esteban Trueba. He was about to forbid him to set foot on the property when Clara convinced him that this was hardly the time to place his political enmities before the peasants' Christian favor. At least he'll bring a little order to matters of the spirit, she said. So in the end, Esteban Trueba welcomed him and invited him to stay in the house with his lay brother, who did not open his mouth and kept his eyes on the ground, his head bowed and his hands joined. The patron was moved by the death of the old man, who had saved the crops from the plague of saints, and his life as well, and he wanted everyone to remember this funeral as a major event. The priest assembled the tenants and the visitors in the little schoolhouse to read through the forgotten Gospels and say a mass for the eternal rest of the soul, Pedro Garcia. Afterward, they withdrew to the room that had been reserved for them in the main house, while everybody else resumed the rowdy celebration that had been interrupted by their arrival. That night, Blanca waited for the guitars and the Indian's lament to quiet down, and for everyone to go to bed before she jumped out of the bedroom window and took off in her usual direction, protected by the shadows. She continued to do so for the next 3 nights until the priest departed. Everyone, except her parents, knew that Blanca was meeting one of them down by the river. It was Pedro Tercero Garcia, who hadn't wanted to miss his father's funeral, and took advantage of the borrowed cassock to harangue the workers house by house, explaining that the coming elections were their chance to shake off the yoke under which they had always lived. They listened in surprise and confusion. For them, time was measured in seasons and thought by generations. They were slow and cautious. Only the very young ones, those who had radios and listened to the news, those who sometimes went down to town and talked with the union men, were able to follow his train of thought. The others listened to him because he was the hero that the owners were after, but they were convinced that he was talking nonsense. If the patron finds out we're voting socialist, we're done for, they said. There's no way he can know. The ballots are secret, the false priest argued back. That's what you think, replied his father, Pedro Segundo. They say they're secret, but afterward they always know exactly who we voted for. Besides, if your party wins, they'll throw us out. We'll lose our jobs. I've always lived here. What would I do? They can't throw you all out because the owner loses more than you do if you go, countered Pedro Tercero. It makes no difference who we voted for. They always win anyway. They changed the ballots, said Blanca, who was at the meeting sitting on the ground among the peasants. This time they can't, said Pedro Tercero. We'll be sending people from the party to watch the polling places and make sure they seal the ballot boxes. But the peasants did not trust him. Experience had taught them in the end that the foxes always eat the hens, despite the subversive ballads that were traveling from north to mouth, preaching just the opposite. Therefore, when a train came through calling the new candidate of the Socialist Party a charismatic, nearsighted doctor who could move crowds with his passionate speeches, they watched him from the station, observed in turn by the owners who formed defense around them, armed with shotguns and clubs. They listened respectfully to what the candidate had to say, but they were afraid to make the least gesture of greeting, except for a few farmhands who, armed with picks and shovels, rushed to surround him and cheered when they were hoarse because they had nothing to lose. They were nomads who wandered the countryside without regular work, without families, without masters, and without fear. Shortly after the death and memorable interment of Pedro Garcia, Blanca began to lose her apple-colored freshness and to suffer from a natural fatigue that was not the result of holding her breath from morning nausea, that was not the result of drinking good wine. She thought it was from eating too much food. It was the season of golden peaches, apricots, and young cooked corn with basil and clay casseroles. It was the season for making marmalade and jam for winter, but neither fasting, chamomile, purgatives, nor rest would cure her. She lost her enthusiasm for the work, the infirmary, and even her ceramic creches. She grew weak and somnolent, could spend hours lying in the shade looking up at the sun, uninterested in anything else. The only activity she kept up with were her nocturnal escapes out the window where she had rendezvous with Pedro Tercero down by the river. Jean de Sedengue, who had not admitted defeat in his romantic siege, observed her closely. Out of discretion, He had spent several periods in the hotel in town and made a few brief journeys to the capital, from which he would return weighed down with brochures about chinchillas, their hutches, their feeding, their sicknesses, their reproductive habits, the method for tanning the skins, and everything else that had to do with those tiny beasts who were destined to be converted into souls. The Count spent most of his summer as a guest at Tres Marias. He was a delightful visitor, well-educated, light-hearted, and calm. He always had a friendly word on the tip of his tongue and was as ready to celebrate the cooking as he was to entertain his horses by playing the piano in the sitting room, where his execution of the Chopin nocturnes rivaled Clara's. He was an inexhaustible source of anecdotes. He woke up late in the morning and devoured an hour or two to the care of his own person. First he would do his exercises and run around the house, oblivious to the taunts of the hardy peasants looking on. Next he would soak himself in a hot bath, and he would take his time selecting the clothing for every occasion in the day. This last activity was a wasted one, because no one appreciated his elegance, and often the only thing he achieved with his British riding outfits, his velvet jackets, and his Trilorian hats with little feathers, was that Clara, with the best of intentions, would offer him clothing more appropriate for the country. Jean did not lose his good humor. He accepted the ironic smiles of the owner of the house, Blanca's grimaces, and the perennial distraction of Clara, who, even after a year, was still asking him his name. He knew how to prepare a few French dishes, perfectly seasoned and magnificently presented, which were his contribution whether there were guests for dinner. It was the first time any of them had seen a man interested in cooking, but they supposed it must be a European custom and did not dare make fun of him for fear of seeming ignorant. Besides the material on the chinchillas, he also brought from the capital the popular wartime booklets that had been created to propagate the image of the heroic soldier, and sentimental novels he had brought for Blanca. In after-dinner conversation, he sometimes referred to, in a tone of utter boredom, to summers spent with the European nobility in the castles of Liechtenstein or the Côte d'Azur.